Let's first talk about rendering from a server component. Starting from a server component gives you the most flexibility in terms of rendering. So let's create a simple page within our Next.js application. Now by default, in the absence of the useClient directive, Next.js will try to render it as a server component. Now this page being a server component itself, of course, if we bring in a server component and render it out, it should work perfectly fine. And if we jump to the browser, that is exactly what we find. Now a key thing to note over here is that this component is not hydrated on the client. In fact, if we open up the console, we see no log statements. However, if you look at the server terminal, you can see that the page as well as the component was rendered on the server. Next, let's bring in a client component. We render it out the same way we rendered out the server component. And once more, as you would expect, this will work perfectly fine. And this can be verified by visiting the page on the browser, and you can see that the server and the client component were rendered perfectly fine. However, the client component will be hydrated on the client. That is, the rendering function will run on the client, and we can verify that by looking at the browser console. Now, of course, as we saw in our useClient lesson, on the server side, all three components are going to render and return their HTML as a part of the response. Now let's talk about the unmarked component. We bring it in just like the server and the client components and render it out as a part of the server page component. Now, as you would expect, this will also work perfectly fine. But let's think about where this component is actually going to get rendered. Since this component is unmarked and being rendered from a server component, it will actually not go through the process of hydration. It will only render on the server, and therefore in the browser console, we see no log statements for this component, and we only find them within the server terminal. So in summary, a server component can render as the server, client, or unmarked components. The child server components will render as server components, the client components will render as client components, and unmarked components will actually render as server components.